Today he is going to give this speech, which is entitled Baseball, Hot Dogs, Apple Pie, and Islam. So I'm excited, I hope you guys are. Let's give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Rany Jazayerli.
All right, can everyone hear me? Assalamu alaikum. Hi everyone. So just so you know, I'm getting over a cold, so if I start coughing uncontrollably, please forgive me. The good news is, I think my voice is deep enough now that I can get a part-time job doing radio commercials, but I would rather not have this cold. So when a son first contacted me to ask if I would come to Kansas City tonight and accept the Crescent Peace Society's Journalism Award, I was very surprised. I was surprised that they wanted to give me this award. I was also surprised that anyone would call me a journalist. But then trying to describe who I am has always been a challenge. I'm many different things all at the same time. A physician, a business owner, a writer, a blogger, an analyst, a quote-unquote baseball expert, an occasional political commentator, a reluctant ambassador to my faith, a small-time radio personality, a social media power user, a husband, and a father. So short, throw journalism on the bottom. Juggling all these different versions of me has never really struck me as an issue, though, because I have juggled two different but not mutually exclusive identities with me since birth. I've always been an American, and I've always been a Muslim, and I have never sensed a contradiction between the two. My parents immigrated to the United States in 1970, and they came seeking what most every immigrant to the United States has sought for centuries: a better life for themselves, and perhaps more importantly, a better life for their children. They arrived in America on a Boeing 747 instead of a crossing ship, and they were processed at the airport in Detroit instead of on Ellis Island. But they harbored the same hopes and ambitions as the generations of immigrants before. My dad had just graduated from medical school at the University of Damascus and came to America to complete his medical residency while sending money home to support his mother and younger sisters. My mother had just turned 17 when they arrived in Michigan. She didn't speak a word of English. They had a 10-month-old daughter with them. My mom had to learn a new language, graduate from high school, and raise her children largely on her own because my father was never around. He was working the punishing hours of a medical resident, and in order to earn extra cash to send home to his family in Syria, after coming home for a quick dinner, he would moonlight the graveyard shift at a different hospital for the princely sum of $8 an hour, come home in the morning, shower, and then head straight back to his residency on no sleep. In 1975, having completed his cardiology training, my father accepted a job in Wichita. In Michigan, at least, there was a large Arab population, but my parents knew no one in Wichita. They were once again starting over, only now they had two daughters, along with a 10-day-old baby boy. That baby boy was me. My brother would follow a year later. When I was older, I asked my parents why they would leave Michigan, where so many of my dad's medical school classmates had settled and where they had a community, for a medium-sized town in the heart of the Great Plains where they didn't know a soul. It turned out the answer was quite simple. My parents moved to Wichita because they weren't sure they were staying in Wichita for very long. Because they weren't sure they were staying in America for very long. Syria was still their homeland, and their dream was to save money for a few years and then return home. But reality has a way of upsetting our best laid plans. In 1977, my father visited Syria for a few weeks. By the time he returned home to Wichita, home was Wichita. Since Hafez al-Assad had solidified his iron grip on power around the time my parents left, Syria had become a bleak totalitarian state. There wasn't much of a future there for him, and there wasn't much of a future there for his children. So Wichita, America became home. My parents took their citizenship in 1978. They became involved with many social organizations in Wichita, the medical societies, the Rotary clubs. The Muslim community in Wichita at that time was tiny, but there was and is a large Lebanese Christian community, and my family was welcomed in. And really, if there is a word to describe how it felt for me growing up in Wichita in the late 1970s and early 1980s, that would be the word, welcome. I not only grew up oblivious to the hardships that my parents had endured to wind up in Wichita in 1975, I grew up oblivious to the notion that as the child of immigrant parents practicing a religion that was almost unheard of in Midwestern America, that I should feel different. It is a tribute to my parents that I didn't know what they had sacrificed for me, but it is a tribute to America that I never felt different, let alone marginalized or ostracized. There was never any contradiction between the religion that my parents taught me and the culture that was all around me. When I was 6 years old, my brother and I engaged in that quintessentially American starter kit of entrepreneurship. We set up a lemonade stand on our front lawn. We were Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts and weebelows in between. My dad built me my car for the Pinewood Derby. We went to the shopping mall with my mom, and we spent every quarter we had at the arcade. And I fell in love with baseball. I don't recall when that happened, because I don't recall a time when I didn't love baseball. My dad tells me that when I was 4 years old, I went to him and I told him I wanted to be a baseball player when I grew up. And like the proper immigrant father that he was, he told his 4-year-old son that I'd grow up to be a professional baseball player when hell froze over. I cried like a baby. I loved everything about the sport. I loved the numbers, obviously. I was a bit of a math prodigy growing up and took home several trophies at the Kansas State math competition while getting to visit cool places like Lawrence and Newton. We still have a picture of 7-year-old me getting a trophy and shaking hands with John Carlin, who was then the governor of Kansas. But I also loved the history of the game, reading not just biographies of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, but 19th century figures like Alice Spalding and Monty Ward. When I was 6 years old, I pestered my dad into spending $50 to buy me the baseball encyclopedia, which is just as big and boring as it sounds. Over 2,000 pages of mostly numbers, detailing every year in baseball history. I loved that book. My parents encouraged me to think of myself as an American through and through. My dad grew up watching World War II movies in the cinemas of Damascus and would make my brother and I sit with him watching old war movies like The Longest Day and the 1980 miniseries Ike. And he took my brother and I to Abilene to see the Eisenhower Library and Museum, not once but twice. There is nothing like learning the history of World War II to convince you that in the Manichaean struggle between good and evil in this world, the good guys are American. Along with baseball, my other obsession growing up was to send letters to the Chamber of Commerce of various cities around America, asking for them to send me information about their city. This is just as geeky and weird as it sounds. I was 7 years old and nothing made me more excited than getting an envelope in the mail from Seattle stuffed with brochures about the Space Needle and the Pike Place Fish Market, or from Philadelphia telling me about Independence Hall and the Benjamin Franklin Museum. And at no time growing up was I ever made to feel that there was supposed to be a conflict between my faith and my country. I know that isn't the experience of every immigrant in America. I know some Muslims who are made to feel like a fish out of water by their own parents, who are so determined to hold on to their cultural heritage that they never let their children think they were American. And I know a few Muslims who are made to feel unwelcome by their neighbors. But I can't say that ever happened to me. My parents wouldn't let it happen, and my neighbors, my community, my city wouldn't let it happen. My affair with America was interrupted in 1984 when I was 9, and my parents announced we were moving to Saudi Arabia, where my dad had received an offer to head a new cardiology clinic that was open. There were many reasons why my parents reluctantly uprooted the family, even though we kept our home in Wichita that they had just built 2 years earlier. While my dad is not particularly religious, my mother is, and as much as she felt at home in Wichita, she found it a struggle to practice her faith in a town where she literally had no practicing Muslim friends. And she was worried how her children would grow up without Muslim friends of their own. And as for my father, his mother was in her 70s, living alone in Damascus. And the last time she visited America, she told my father that she was never coming back. In Saudi Arabia, she was able to live with us every winter until she passed away a few years later. So we moved to Saudi Arabia, coming home to Wichita every summer for a few months. I lived there for 7 years until I came back to America to start college in 1991. And though I can't say I was happy living there, I have no regrets over the move because it was an unparalleled chance to learn my faith. But far from weakening my connection to America, it only strengthened it. Saudi Arabia is an unusual place to live, with with more foreigners than native Saudis, and where mingling between the two rarely occurred. I attended an American junior high, and when the American school only went up to 9th grade, I attended a British high school. My friends were American and British expatriates like myself, and whereas before my Muslim identity was what made me unique and special, now it was my American identity that made me unique and special. And I embraced it. After taking for granted the freedoms that I had in America, living in a society that didn't have those freedoms made me take stock of just how damn lucky I was to be in America. And while I learned my faith there, I also saw the disconnect between the true teachings of the religion and the way the people in the very birthplace of Islam practiced it. I felt the strict interpretation of scripture and the lack of tolerance for other interpretations. I saw the rank hypocrisy of the Saudi royal family lecturing on morality while they themselves engaged in debauchery. I saw the horrible treatment of women, not only forcing half the population to stay essentially out of sight, but to this very day, they forbid women from driving in Saudi Arabia. Foreign workers from poor societies, like Pakistan and the Philippines, were treated poorly and sometimes cheated out of small sums of money they were working for. I didn't truly become religious until after I left Saudi Arabia, because I was so turned off by the way that Islam was put into practice there. But even this was a blessing, because once I realized that Muslims could practice their religion so imperfectly in the very heart of the Muslim world, I realized that there was no special benefit for a Muslim to live in a quote-unquote Muslim country. In Saudi Arabia, or even when we would visit family in Syria, I would meet people who would tell me that I could not possibly be as good a Muslim in America as I could in the Muslim world. But I knew better. I saw so much dysfunction in the Arab world that I saw America as a place where Muslims could practice their faith, not just free of the cultural baggage that had accrued in Muslim countries over centuries, but also free of government oppression and interference. The seminal moment in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him, was the hijrah, the self-imposed exile of him and his small community of Muslims from their homeland of Mecca to the city of Medina, which by the standards of the day was a world away, a 10-day journey under the best of conditions. They had left a homeland that had become unbearable for them in order to form a new Muslim community among more hospitable neighbors. And it was the key moment in the rise of Islam from a small persecuted faith on the Arabian Peninsula into a global religion. I strongly believe that the migration of Muslims from the traditional Muslim world to America echoes that seminal hijrah to the best of our feeble abilities. Centuries of stagnation and oppression, some from within, some imposed by Western colonialism, has led the Muslim world into some dead ends and some dark alleys. A new hijrah may be our community's best hope to find our way back to the path of God. And as much as our government's foreign policy sometimes leaves something to be desired, the reality is that there is simply nowhere in the world better than America for Muslim immigrants to attempt to build a new community worthy of the model established by the Prophet and his companions in Medina 1,400 years ago. So I returned to America when I was 16 years old, living on my own in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University, and quickly found the two things that I had been looking for my whole life, the two things that probably better define me today than anything else: an authentic American Islam and baseball. When my freshman year started, I found the Muslim Students Association on campus. While I had known Americans my whole life, and I had known Muslims for most of my life, very rarely had I met people that matched both halves of my personality. Suddenly I was surrounded by friends like me, who grew up in America, who were the children of immigrant parents, who were trying to negotiate their place in the world between being American and being Muslim. The kind of people who I could party with without drinking alcohol, or watch a football game with, and then stop and perform the afternoon prayer during a commercial break. And at the same time, finally got a chance to let my baseball freak flag fly. As you may know, the Royals went to the playoffs in 1984 and won the World Series in 1985, but I missed all of it living in Saudi Arabia. I was still a big baseball fan living overseas, and while home in the summer of 1989, I finally took the plunge and became a hardcore Royals fan. From then on, I would take a 15-minute ride with our driver to the International Shopping Mall in Saudi Arabia a couple times a week just to pick up a copy of USA Today so I could see how the Royals were doing. But all of this was a pale substitute to actually being in America and watching baseball games all the time on TV or even at the ballpark. Until the summer I began college, I had never attended a major league game. And then I started college at Johns Hopkins, which was 6 blocks away from the Baltimore Orioles' old stadium. I was a man dying of thirst, and someone just opened up a fire hydrant on me, and I drank as much as I could. That first month of college, I attended 6 Orioles games, and when they opened their new ballpark the next year, I attended 18 more. Most of them were against the Royals, but I was just so happy to see baseball, the game I'd obsessed with my entire life, up close and personal. I got to watch the World Series live on TV. I was happy as a pig in slump. A month into my freshman year, I saw a flyer inviting people to join a fantasy baseball league on campus. And just as I had met American Muslims just like myself for the first time, now I suddenly met a dozen guys who were as obsessed with baseball as I was. College is the place where you discover who you are going to be for the rest of your life. And I'm incredibly grateful that I made the friends that I did then, friends that helped me discover who I wanted to be and made me realize it was perfectly okay to be who I wanted. I was in the right place at the right time. It was also the right time to go to college because it was in the early 90s that the internet exploded on campuses first before going nationwide. And as soon as I got online, I started looking for like-minded baseball fans there. I found them in one place, on a bulletin board known as Rec Sport Baseball. And it was there that my accidental evolution into a baseball writer began. I had already been indoctrinated into the world of sabermetrics, which is the use of data to study baseball, after picking up a copy of a baseball abstract written by Bill James, himself a Royals fan, who lived just down the road here in Lawrence, at the local bookstore when I was 13 years old. To a 13-year-old kid with no preconceived notions of the right or wrong way to win a baseball game, Bill James' writings and ideas of using data to understand baseball made perfect sense to me, even if it didn't make perfect sense to people who were actually running baseball teams. And online, I found people even more like me than my new baseball buddies in college, people who not only had read everything Bill James had written, but had tried to build on his ideas with research of their own. I tried to do the same thing. By my senior year, I was proposing new ideas for evaluating pitching prospects in the minor leagues, a system that got the attention of one of the deans of the bulletin board, a man named Gary Huckabee. He reached out to me and told me he was planning to write an annual baseball preview book the following winter and would love to have me involved. By the following winter, I had graduated from college and started medical school at the University of Michigan. But the first year of medical school had a pass-fail grading system, so let's just say I didn't feel the pressure to apply myself to my studies 100%. So I contacted Gary in November to see what the status of his book project was. He told me he had no publisher, he had no source of income, he had no market for the book. So of course we were going to write the book. He had 2 friends he was going to bring on board with me, and I invited my friend Joe Sheehan, who I met in a fantasy league, to join us. Together, the 5 of us wrote the first edition of Baseball Prospectus in 1996. I had no idea where this would lead. I only knew that I loved baseball so much that I wanted to make the game better, and I was arrogant enough to think that an analytical approach to baseball would make the game better. And it has. Once again, I was in the right place at the right time. We sold about 150 copies of that first book, but none of us had any expectations of doing any better, so it didn't diminish our enthusiasm for the project one bit. We sold over 1,000 copies the next year and got some media mentions for the first time. The year after that, we found a small publisher. Then we moved to a medium-sized publisher a few years after that, and then a big publisher a few years after that. And in 2007, for the first time, we had reached the New York Times bestseller list. We started our website in 1996, and what started as a trickle of hits became a stream which became a flood. I was invited by ESPN to write a few columns for their new website in 1999. And that led to a long-term relationship between Baseball Prospectus and ESPN. One of those columns I wrote about was about the Royals, which got the attention of 810 Radio here in Kansas City, and they asked me to come on and talk about it. So a one-time gig became an occasional appearance, which turned into a regular gig, which turned into me hosting my own show talking about the Royals every week during the season. Baseball Prospectus was becoming a hot new place for aspiring writers to get their break. In 2002, we brought on a talented young writer and statistician named Nate Silver, who unveiled a breakthrough projection system called Banquet that quickly became the industry standard. Nate eventually got bored with writing about baseball, and in 2008 decided to project the presidential election. You may have heard of him, he's probably the most famous nerd in America right now. Meanwhile, baseball teams themselves came around with the idea that analytics could help teams win. First it was the Oakland A's, and then in 2003 the book Moneyball was published by Michael Lewis, showing how Oakland was winning through their use of analytics, which changed the landscape forever. In 2004, the Boston Red Sox, with a general manager still in his 20s, and with the legendary Bill James on their payroll, won their first world championship in 80 years. Claiming to be Muslim, we all feared the worst. If members of a small minority in any Muslim country had launched a terrorist attack on some of their nation's most important symbols, killing thousands in the process, that nation's response to the innocent members of that minority would have been savage. But if America was being tested as to whether it would live up to its lofty principles that day, then by and large it passed the test. There were isolated incidents of violence, such as the gas station attendant in Arizona who was shot and killed. But all things considered, it could have been much, much worse. My wife and I attended vigils after 9/11 and were astounded at how Muslims and non-Muslims alike prayed together, how little anger we felt from our fellow Americans, how many people even reached out to make sure that we were okay and that no one was harassing us. I felt compelled to speak out against what happened, and I reached out to my editor at ESPN, asking for the opportunity to write a column speaking about what 9/11 meant to me as an American Muslim. My request got run up the flagpole all the way to the bigwigs at ESPN, and they gave me the thumbs up. So I wrote the article that they titled "A Plea for Tolerance." It is probably the most read article I've ever written. It's certainly the most important article I've ever written. I condemned terrorism and the murder of innocents, which unequivocally, which seemed like a no-brainer, and which every Muslim I knew felt the same way, but somehow needed to be said at a time when so few Muslims had a media voice in America. I got over 6,000 email replies. They ran about 95% positive, which still astonishes me. Now, the vibe in America would unfortunately slowly turn, and tolerance would lose more than a few battles against fear, leading to things like the Patriot Act, Guantanamo, the global war on terror, and the war on Iraq. But at least at that moment, America put its foot down and said, we are not giving in to fear, and we are not giving in to hate. I have never been more afraid to be a Muslim than the week after 9/11. But I have also never been more proud to be American than I was the week after 9/11. I'm 40 now, and I have 4 kids and 15 employees. I don't have nearly as much time to write about baseball as I used to. I walked away from Baseball Prospectus a few years ago and was thinking of retiring from writing entirely in 2011 when Banquet, the new venture from ESPN and sports writer Bill Simmons, came calling. They've given me free rein to write about whatever I'm passionate about, whenever I have the time ever since. Mostly that means I write about baseball. But when the movie Ender's Game was released 2 years ago, I wrote an essay about the science fiction classic that the movie was based on and about the author's very human portrayal of Muslim characters in his book. Banquet, like everywhere else I have written, has been happy to accommodate the Muslim side of me without restriction. I'd written about the Royals online going back to 1998 when I started exchanging emails with Rob Nair, a columnist at ESPN.com. For 15 years, he probably exposed more readers to analytics than anyone in history, and who was also a Royals fan. He had started putting our emails on his own personal website, calling it Rob and Rany on the Royals. But after a decade of writing about a really, really bad team, Rob finally had enough in 2008. So I started my own website and called it Rany on the Royals. I wrote about the Royals, the good and the bad, mostly the bad, as often as I could, which at the beginning was quite often. Slowly it became a popular read among Royals fans, and whenever the Royals did anything, people wanted to know my opinion. I became a regular on a 10 radio during town. After 20 years of writing about baseball, I had suddenly become a tiny bit famous, at least among a tiny slice of baseball fans. What I hadn't done is see the Royals play a meaningful game, ever. As you know, they hadn't made the playoffs in 29 years. And then just as I was about to give up, it happened. I had already announced that 2014 would be my last season writing about the Royals on my blog. But what a year to go out. A South Korean Royals fan named Sung-Woo Lee, a friend of mine on Twitter, arrived in Kansas City in August and became such a local sensation that I wrote about the story for my blog. And then he became such a national sensation that the New York Times called and asked if they could reprint my story. And then the Royals started winning, and then they clinched their first playoff spot in 29 years, and then they won the greatest wild card game ever played, and I had the privilege of being there and writing about it for Banquet. And when they went to Game 7 of the World Series, I had the privilege and heartbreak of being there too. Sungwoo was there as well, this time brought back to America by a documentary crew that interviewed me for my part in the story. This 30 for 30 documentary is scheduled to air on ESPN next month and is slated to premiere at the Kansas City Film Festival a week from Monday. Once again, I was in the right place at the right time. Everything that I have accomplished is a testament to a nation that doesn't stand in the way of its newest residents reaching their fullest potential. This nation did not stand in the way of my parents when they immigrated. It did not stand in their way when they chose to stay here and make America their home. It did not stand in their way when they worked day and night in pursuit of the American dream. It did not stand in the way of their children obtaining world-class educations at its best universities. It did not stand in the way of an immigrant family becoming free and full citizens in every sense. This is not to say that America is perfect, or even to say that America has treated all of its immigrants perfectly. 2 centuries of African immigrants were brought to America in shackles. It is not lost on me that for all the potential disadvantages I had as a child of immigrant parents, I had a nation hole. I was born white. I know from my brown Muslim friends whose parents hail from India or Pakistan or Malaysia that not every immigrant child has lived a life completely free from prejudice. We can always do better. We can always push for America to adhere more perfectly to its ideals. Those of us who have lived the immigrant experience are perhaps more aware of what America aspires to, because it is that aspiration that drew us to America in the first place. To fulfill the dream of John Winthrop in 1630, when the Puritan proclaimed in his sermon that his new Massachusetts community shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. And so as immigrants, I believe we have a special responsibility to stand with our fellow citizens who have as yet been denied America's special grace. We owe it to the ideals of this great nation to have solidarity with the least of these. When the African American community says that Black lives matter, we have an obligation to listen. And I am proud to say that the Muslim community in America is rising to this challenge, as other faith communities are. That we are joining our fellow Americans in rallies, that we are petitioning our elected representatives for reform of the penal code, which disproportionately punishes people of color. After all, nearly 1/3 of the Muslims in America are African American, the vast majority of whom are not immigrants but have been indigenous in America for centuries. Some say that America has peaked, that it is a nation in slow decline, that though the 20th century was the American century, the 21st century will belong to someone else, perhaps the Chinese century or the Brazilian century or the Russian century. Perhaps it will. Our position as the preeminent nation on earth is not something we can take for granted. But I see little reason to worry about America's place in the world so long as she stays true to her legacy as a nation of immigrants, so long as she honors the Emma Lazarus poem etched into the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty in 1903. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So long as America opens her door to the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, she will find among these huddled masses the key to securing her future. She will find a 6-year-old fleeing Russia with his family because of Jewish persecution in 1979. And 2 decades later, this immigrant child, Sergey Brin, would change all their lives when he co-founded Google. Or she will find a Syrian immigrant named Abdul Fattah Jindali, who immigrated to America in the 1950s to pursue a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin. Mr. Jindali fell in love with a woman named Joanne Schiebel, who bore him a son, but was forced by her disapproving father to break off the relationship, in part because Abdul Fattah was a Muslim. So to avoid the scandal of raising a child out of wedlock, they both agreed to put the child up for adoption. And so in 1955, the biological son of a Syrian Muslim named Abdul Fattah Jindali was adopted by a couple in the Bay Area who named him Steve Jobs. So long as America opens its doors to the Sergey Brins and Steve Jobs of the world and gives them opportunities that other countries won't or can't provide, she will continue to be that city upon a hill that others gaze upon. And this is why, as I see it, the greatest threat to American exceptionalism is not a closing of the American mind, but a closing of the American heart and a closing of the American border. Just as America has been shaped by waves of immigrants, each wave has been met by a sentiment of nativism that opposed it. From the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 to the Know Nothing movement of the 1850s, to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, to the national quota system that restricted immigrants from the Muslim world to come to America all the way until the Immigration Act of 1965, there has always been a wellspring of resistance to immigration in America. But just as we have overcome this resistance in the past, I am confident that the current anti-immigration sentiment in certain quarters of America will be swept away. I believe that America has a particular responsibility to open its doors, though, to a certain set of immigrants, more tired and more poor, more huddled and more wretched than most. The refugees that have fled my parents' homeland of Syria by the millions. For as enlightened as America is when it comes to foreigners who wash up on her shore, that is how ignorant American can be when it comes to foreign policy in the first place. I will resist the temptation to get political here, but I feel compelled to point out two simple and completely diametrically opposed facts. In 2003, the United States launched a full-ground invasion of an Arab country in order to get rid of a totalitarian dictator, despite the fact that this country's people were not in active revolt, that this dictator was oppressing his people, but not killing them indiscriminately by the thousands, despite the fact that this country was ultimately not found to possess weapons of mass destruction. In 2011, the United States chose not to lift a finger when the people of a neighboring Arab country started peacefully protesting in the streets. The United States did not provide help when an active revolution broke out and the totalitarian dictator responded by murdering unarmed civilians in cold blood by the tens of thousands. We didn't establish a safe zone when the dictator had his air force bomb entire cities into rubble. And in 2013, the dictator, Bashar al-Assad, indisputably used weapons of mass destruction, releasing chemical gas that killed 1,400 civilians in minutes. Yet even after already declaring the use of chemical weapons to be a red line that could not be crossed, our government responded by simply collecting the country's remaining chemical weapons store. And in 2015, as Syria has become the greatest humanitarian crisis the world has seen since World War II, our government openly talks about a diplomatic solution to the crisis which could keep the totalitarian dictator in power. No matter what side of the political spectrum you fall upon, you have to acknowledge that America screwed up somewhere in this process. Either through action or inaction, we made a mess of the Middle East, and we therefore bear some responsibility for that mess. What has happened to Syria is an almost indescribable tragedy. Of 23 million people who lived in Syria before the revolution began, 250,000 are confirmed dead. Another 250,000 have simply gone missing, and most of them were arrested by the government, which for most means that death would be a sweet release from unimaginable torture. 11 million people, nearly half the population, has been displaced from their homes. 4 million people are refugees in other countries, the majority of them in neighboring countries like Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. But those countries are themselves running out of space for refugees. 1 out of every 5 people in Lebanon today is a Syrian refugee. So as you have probably heard, hundreds of thousands of Syrians are now trying to find a new home in Europe. And so as I finish, I'd like to ask 2 favors from everyone in the audience today. The first favor is to simply understand the nature of what has happened in Syria. ISIS is a repulsive, monstrous group of people with a grossly twisted understanding of Islam. They have murdered and enslaved thousands of innocents, and they need to be eliminated by the global community. But they are not the root of the problem in Syria. And eliminating them alone is not the solution. I cannot impress this upon you enough. The Syrian catastrophe is the work of a dictator whose family has ruled Syria with an iron fist for 50 years, a family that worships only power, and to respond to peaceful protests to his rule with cold-blooded murder of thousands upon thousands of people. Entire cities have essentially ceased to exist. I have several friends whose own relatives were killed, including women and children, and every one of their relatives was killed by government forces. ISIS is not the root of the problem. ISIS was the inevitable response to the problem. In 2011, I spoke with an Illinois congresswoman and told her quite plainly that if the moderate secular rebels, most of whom were army soldiers who defected rather than follow orders to shoot their own people, were not given support by America, that the religious extremists who are already getting funding from places like Saudi Arabia to procure weapons would gain power instead. It's a very simple issue. If someone is trying to kill you and your family for no other reason than that you criticize the government, or because your neighbor criticized the government and you're just collateral damage, you will be sympathetic to anyone who is willing to protect you and your family. If the US Army suddenly camped outside Overland Park and threatened to attack, and the city were unarmed, and the only people who came with weapons to defend you were members of the Westboro Baptist Church, well, guess who just became your new best friend? I only expressed to the Congresswoman what the vast majority of the Syrian immigrant community felt. 4 years later, not only has the situation become even more dire than any of us could have imagined, the Syrian government has succeeded in confusing the global community as to who the real bad guys are in this conflict. When the revolution broke out, in fact, the government released the most hardcore Islamic extremists from their prison, knowing that once these extremists joined the opposition, they would try to convert the revolution into a sectarian affair. So I ask all of you, no matter what you think needs to be done now to end the bloodshed, to at least correctly identify the people who started. Those brave Syrians who gave the last full measure of devotion to fight against tyranny do not deserve to have their sacrifice forgotten, or worse, twisted into a fight on behalf of extremists. The second favor I ask of you is to help the Syrian people in any way you are able to. After 4 years of ever worsening conflict, there has been a level of donor fatigue, and charitable contributions to Syrian refugees are declining even as the need reaches ever higher levels. So please, give whatever you can. I've worked with the Syrian American Medical Society, or SAMS, which has provided invaluable medical relief to the victims of the conflict. And when I put my Rany on the Royals website on hiatus this summer, I asked my readers to make whatever contribution they could to this organization. And in exchange, I would do various favors for them. Call them on the phone, take them out to lunch, take them out to a Royals game. I'm pleased to say that we have so far raised over $18,000 in charity, and that I owe an awful lot of people a day at the ballpark, possibly including a few people in this room. If you can donate to SAMS or to any of the wonderful charities working on behalf of refugees inside and outside of Syria, I would be grateful. Whether you can help financially or not, I would also ask that you raise awareness and pressure our government to accept more Syrian refugees for resettlement in America. Our nation of immigrants has been uncharacteristically slow to open its door to the huddled masses gathering in refugee camps across the Arab world. The United States has only accepted 1,500 Syrian refugees so far, a shamefully low amount. Last week, President Obama announced that America would accept an additional 10,000 Syrian refugees a year going forward. And even if that comes to pass, that is still a number unworthy of American greatness. Germany has announced it will accept 800,000 refugees a year. More than 11,000 people in Iceland, a country with a smaller population than Wichita, have signed a petition offering to house Syrian refugees in their own homes. America has always been a shining example to the world in offering a place of refuge for those with no home to call their own. And I pray that does not change now. So please talk to your friends, your colleagues, and above all, your elected officials, and ask that they honor the legacy of this great nation to a people who need it, a people who have lost everything. But the mere fact that I can stand before you today and talk about a nation that my parents left 45 years ago is testament to the greatness of this nation. My entire career as a sports writer, as a media personality, as a quasi-famous person that led me to standing up here tonight, all of it was one big happy accident. I never meant for any of this to happen. But all of it was only made possible because America is the land of possibility, because America is the land of immigrants, because America is a place where a Muslim kid with no baseball talent whatsoever can offer up his ideas about the sport and be taken seriously. I've been in the right place at the right time so many times because America has always been the right place for me, which only meant that I had to put in the time. Thank you and good night.
Wow, what a wonderful presentation that was. Thank you again for sharing your story and shining the light on certain situations. That's what Dressing Peace is all about, really, is bringing people together, working together to find solutions. And I think that was a great sort of narrative to tie everything together. Thank you again for your great comments there.